All right, so this is mind mending with Lens. Low Energy Neurofeedback System by Len Ochs, Ph.D. Lens was developed over 15 years ago by Len Ochs. This gentle, non-invasive neuro and biofeedback technique is helping people all over the world again regain brain function and reclaim their lives. This can be viewed as a way to painlessly reboot and re-energize the brain, allowing greater ease in learning, work, and play. The results include clearer thinking, better sleep, emotions that are easier to manage, and better memory. Len Ochs, Ph.D., has worked as a school psychologist. Began his, yeah. It's pretty lengthy. He's got some background. So please welcome Dr. Ochs.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and for being here. I want to say a couple of things kind of at once. First, neurofeedback is a way of kind of pulling yourself out of the water like AAA does, get you back on the road again. But you really need to round it out with a whole bunch of other procedures like good nutrition, like exercise. The neurofeedback itself is a technique that is kind of like electronic medicine. I spend a lot of time with meditators, and they can no longer meditate. So that's where I get called in. And one session of the Lens, and the Lens, and I'll explain it, is a little bit different than standard neurofeedback. One session with the Lens is about equal to about 7 years of meditation, according to the meditators. And it helps a person get very, very, very quiet. And that's one of the benefits of the instrumentation. Right now we use feedback EEGs. EEG is electroencephalogram to measure the brain waves. And there's a lot of junk that goes on in the head. And the head can be a lot quieter. And it's really quite amazing what can be achieved when the head becomes quite quiet. On the other hand, neurofeedback is exactly like some of the problems that were described in the last talk. Neurofeedback devices pick up millionths of a volt off the skin of the scalp. No one knows what we're measuring. No one does. We have a very crude way of measuring what's coming off the scalp, and people do amazing things. They start to think again. They start to read. They start to plan when they couldn't after a bump in the head. Stress-related problems pretty much disappear. It's really amazing. But neurofeedback takes a very, very long time to work. The Lens is a very specific kind of neurofeedback which doesn't depend on learning. So a person can be daydreaming and thinking bad thoughts, and they'll become harder and harder to think with the bad thoughts. They just kind of disappear, they kind of vaporize with the Lens. Standard neurofeedback is a learning tool. You use learning to learn to control your brain waves. You have to think, you have to pay attention. And a lot of the people that traditional neurofeedback works can't think. They can't pay attention. So you're asking someone to help themselves by doing the things that they can't do. So the Lens gets around that by not being a learning process. There are no learning criteria, there are no thresholds, there are no punishment, there's no rewards in the Lens. It is amazing what happens when, through the equipment, a person just pays attention to themselves and lets themselves change naturally. It's astounding. And, you know, people who come into my office, and this is as an example of a feedback EEG. This is 1950s technology. The new things that are on the market are 20 times less expensive, 1/20th the size of this, and it's not even the same. It's not even an EEG. It measures skin temperature. Why? Because people who get hooked up to these things with electrodes feel warmer at the end of the session. You know that almost everybody who comes in with a stress-related problem feels colder. Is it their thyroid? Who knows what it is, but they feel colder. And they start to feel tingles and ripples down their arms as signs of blood flow. But we're all such strangers to ourselves. Most people can't even feel themselves and notice differences from one place in the body to the next. And partaking in this kind of feedback experience gives them the beginnings of sensory awareness. And they pay attention to themselves after the end, and they will flood with warmth just because they're observing themselves. Now, there are two questions that I have. One is, and this comes from the objections to people to what I have to say. They say it's too simple. What's going on really is people are having a placebo response to this neurofeedback. They get better too fast with the lens. The lens is, the average numbers of sessions for the lens is about 10. It's about 40 to 60 standard neurofeedback sessions to do the same kind of work. So they call it placebo. And how many people have not heard of placebo? Placebo is a kind of a hypnotic belief that something is going to help. And they say that the great effects that the lens has are strictly placebo. And I say to them, how many chances has each person who comes in, who've been to the astrologer and to the physician and to the nurse and to the nutritionist, how many people have these people been to before coming to see me? Each one of these each one of these encounters is a chance for another placebo reaction. Why do they have to have placebo only when they come to see me? It's a little odd. It doesn't make much sense. They have had so many chances for placebos, and somehow I get accused of creating a placebo response with the neurofeedback. Why does the lens work? And that's because we scramble up the mechanism that perpetuates the problem. Even some medical problems have fear attached to them. Many people are afraid of going to a physician or a nurse or something like that. They're afraid that they're going to have a lot of gobbledygook thrown at them, be told to take a pill, and they'll be confused and dazed, and they'll feel like their health is being stolen from them by the person trying to help them. Folks, I do nothing except have people pay attention to themselves through the magnified feedback that the Lens neurofeedback provides. I do nothing. When I first started doing this, I wanted to make sure that if the government got hold of these devices, they couldn't torture their servicemen. If the NSA got hold of these devices, I wanted to make sure that the government was not able to hype up the soldiers working for them in the airplanes and get them to concentrate for long periods of time. There's a story called Foundation and Empire, and I think maybe Robert Heinlein wrote the stories. And he was afraid that the people in the power structure in the health field, or not, I'm sorry, in politics, would take over the universe. So he started another civilization all the way at the end of the universe, so that when the evil empire started to take over, that there would be people parked at the end of the universe who would know the techniques of how to fight people from the empire. And I've done this with the Lens. I have let non-licensed individuals have the Lens and train them on how to use it. The training is very important. It's very extensive. And if the psychologists and physicians begin to take power and to control these devices, then they're not going to be doing the good work that they should be able to do. So what I've done is kind of park the technology in odd places by non-licensed people, so that if people who are licensed and who work for the state take over, that these would be safe and be in people's hands. So it's really quite interesting what happens when the power structure takes over a method for health control. So here are some graphs. I have access to every session that was ever done with the Lens. And they're automatically uploaded anonymously to the web, so that if perchance the data is hacked by someone, all they'll see is numbers. There will be no personal information. There's no way to identify any of the data that I'm going to show you. So on this second one down, the top one down is the HAS, differences at the HAS, the site with the highest amplitude. Does not show the differences, but the site with the lowest amplitude does show the differences. There are black bars and there are blue tops to the black bars. The blue tops represent the variability in the coming out of the brain. Variability is a very, very important feature of every living measurement. If the heart has no variability, then you're going to get 60 beats per minute or 70 beats per minute, and there's not going to be any variation. The people that have no variation are at risk for a stroke. So I've applied that to the brain, and I say if the brain frequencies don't have any variation, then there's some kind of risk. And as a matter of fact, what I've discovered that if I just look at the variability and I just work where, see how there's less blue on this bar here? That has less variability than this bar. The best way to get a person back to functioning is just to remove the suppression, the part that flattens out the variability. And it's that simple. So I'm working with people who have are said to have by their physicians said to have seizures in their back, which is not possible because seizures are some coming from the brain, and by removing the restriction on the variability on the brain, people start to function again. They start to think again. They wake up. They're quiet. They don't get rattled as easily as other people do. So these bars are strictly variability. The red ones, the maroon ones, and this is the black is the amplitude and the blue is the variability sitting on top. So if I, using the lens, remove the variability, even the most difficult people sometimes are the easiest to work with. And I'm thinking, is this possible? Is it possible to allow the variability to be removed without doing anything? Is that at all possible? Because people are so highly trained in our culture to fuss with things and to move the brain waves around the head and get the frequencies and the amplitudes where they should be. You don't have to do that. It's a lot easier than anybody thinks if you know what you're doing. So what this graph shows for people that have a site where there are low amplitudes, and the low amplitudes are, and this is a good example in the first session, but not in the last session. You can have low amplitudes and that are elevated, and then at the last session, the same sites are very much lower, and in this graph, the highest average dominant, oh, this is frequency, okay. This is amplitude, and amplitude is the height of the brain waves, how strong they are. So if you have them very compressed starting out in the first session and in the last session, there's a huge difference. Not so much where there are high amplitude sites, but on the sites where there are low amplitudes, you'll see a tremendous difference as the suppression is taken off the low amplitude and it expands there. The average duration of treatment, again for the lens, where you see these big changes in physical changes and emotional changes and cognitive changes, are 10 sessions. Alt-tab. Okay, so this is an example of 10 questionnaires being filled out on movement problems. You notice in the first questionnaire, go ahead, that there's a big drop in movement symptoms, and that persists with all the rest of them. Okay. Then there's emotional symptoms that go down, session after session after session. And then there's sensory, loud noises. Each sound has a tinge to them. These are some of the problems that people have. You notice I'm not talking about diagnosis, I'm talking about problems. the higher the dots are, the more fatigued the person is. So the person is becoming more and more and more awake. And in terms of clarity, the person is getting clearer and clearer and clearer as the intensity of the symptoms drop over the course of sessions. And I think people are just unbelievable. Memory problems decrease. Anxiety is a central mediation for all of these issues. And I'm going to try to make this smaller because you really don't need to see great detail. There we go. And you notice how anxiety goes down or goes up initially, so the person becomes more anxious. It's really interesting that people want to change, and the changes that they undergo are, even if they want the change, they're anxiety producing. So people really change very much, very rapidly with the lens. And then the amplitudes go down. The amplitudes of the symptoms go down. And then they go up again. And on some of these things, the anxiety will control the return of symptoms. So I guess that's not really clear how anxiety controls the other symptoms on this. But sometimes, like the anxiety goes up over here, and you see a corresponding dip in energy that gets kicked off by this, by this activation in anxiety. There are sensory disturbances. I remember one guy who had a head injury would look out the window and he says, you know, around that leaf is kind of like a rainbow. And I moved the electrode a little bit on the forehead and the rainbow disappeared. That's a visual disturbance. And it's not written up in any medical book. And it's probably due to this device kicking off a relaxation of the blood vessels. And the brain gets stimulated, even though this is an EEG and it measures the electroencephalogram. The thing that makes people feel warmer is the relaxation of the blood vessels. And that is a very, very surprising finding because everyone in the field thinks that this really has a direct impact on the brain. It doesn't. We were taught many things. I'm sorry?
It's oxygen being carried to the brain. It's oxygen being carried to the
Yes,
brain.
you get by relaxing the blood vessel walls, you get more oxygen and more nutrients that go to the brain, and the brain responds instantaneously to that. So I don't think that this device really works with the brain. I think it works with the blood vessels. And to test that out, I've got a new generation of very much smaller devices that are skin temperature devices. And they are very impactful for people that have chronically constricted blood vessels in the brain. Because those blood vessels open up, they relax the blood vessels' walls. Skin temperature is a measure of blood volume. And because the blood volume increases, the temperature at the skin increases as well. It's that simple. And we still have a picture of brain waves as being impacted by this. And I'm sorry, that's a little bit old-fashioned. We have much better information now on people feeling, you know, I'm really glad, they might say, that you asked me about my warmth, because no one has ever asked me about that. You look puzzled in the blue shirt with the glasses. Yeah.
Who is this useful for?
It's useful for anybody with functioning
If
problems.
you have a question, raise your hand, please, and I'll get you a mic. Thanks.
It's useful for anybody with a functioning problem. They can't think, they can't read, they can't plan. They typically have had a bump on the head, and they could have had an emotional trauma, an illness in their head. It doesn't clear up. They can have residual viruses in there. So this is not the only game in town. They should be working with a good physician who's competent in this particular area. But frankly, there's nothing that will duplicate just getting feedback. And it may be hard to understand. I can't understand it, but it may be hard to understand, yes.
It's almost as if I came in the middle of a talk. I didn't hear the first part. I'd like to have some idea of what this device is, how it attaches, and just something about the physical of it so we can understand what it is you're doing on these charts. I'm missing some really key element.
This is a feedback EEG. EEG is the name of the device, and it picks up through wires attached to the scalp the feedback. And unlike, this is about the LENS, Low Energy Neurofeedback System. In contrast to other neurofeedback systems, there is a lot of manipulation and a lot of fussing that goes on with learning thresholds.
So you hook up the EEG electrodes.
Yeah,
the machine is doing what?
The machine is just doing recording, that's all.
It's recording. And there's no feedback to the person? No display?
Yes, there is no display to the person with the lens. I'm sorry?
I don't understand either. What is the lens?
The LENS is a Low Energy Neurofeedback System. That's an acronym.
See, I feel like I came in the middle.
Hold on.
Yeah. So just getting the feedback is enough to induce a change. Okay, the wires that go to this from the head carry feedback information to the EEG. Going up the wires back to the skin of the head is actually feedback, which is a mirror image of, it's a reflection of what goes on in the head. So the presence of this is what's so hard to understand here. The presence of the feedback going up the wires to the skin is somehow decoded, and there are supposed to be protein molecules in the skin that are sensitive to the feedback. And one way or the other, information goes to the brain. Yes.
So, well, maybe I'll follow up your questions. So kind of backing up even a little bit further and then to that. So somebody has an issue, they come to you, you sit them down, and you hook them up to this machine. And so then I gather from they've got the electrodes that are detectors, but then you're also just saying that there's another set of electrodes that are feeding back into the skull.
No,
the detector.
It's the same set of electrodes that feed back to the skull. So the wires carry the information from the head to the box, to the amplifier, and then the feedback comes right up the same wires
So it feeds back to the same wires.
Right.
Okay. So the person isn't looking at or visualizing, there's no visualization of what they're feeding.
No, there's no, I don't know what they're doing, but they say,
sensation.
is there anything I should do? And I said, it doesn't make any difference what you do.
And are you asking them questions or?
No. What it does.
You're not interviewing them or doing anything like that?
No. In fact, we sit there in silence. They shut their eyes because the muscles to the eyes will generate more voltage than the brain does. So if they keep their eyes open, they're going to override the voltages picked up from the brain.
I got a question regarding the current going back up the wires. You're sensing microvolts.
Yes.
What is the electrical characteristics of the stimulation that's coming back out of this device, and what is the time relationship if you see some waveform? How long before you're going to actually pump a voltage onto the electrode?
It's less than a quarter of a second, and that the timing between the event on the head and the registering on the screen, or the registering of impulses back to them. And it was the first question, and that was the second question.
What kind of voltage level or current level going back up the electrode?
It's about 0.006 microamps of current. Now, one of the engineers who was behind this development of these boxes took, we used to have feedback coming over LEDs. We no longer do that because it got absurd that so little current and so little voltage, down to millionths of a volt, could generate any signals going into the LEDs and flash them. And he dark adapted his eyes, and he looked through a microscope, and he could see the twinkling of the light emitting diodes. So even though the voltages and the currents are too small to notice, when we had Lawrence Livermore Lab take a look at this stuff, and they said, essentially you're doing nothing, but it's biologically active. And I said, wait a minute. And this is a hearkening back to the discussion on EMF, because what we do is, say we have a computer and we harvest the electromagnetic fields in the computer, and we use these as a carrier wave for the feedback. In other words, the feedback, everything needs a carrier wave to be transmitted. So my sound is going on a carrier wave of the air molecules going back and forth. We use a carrier wave for the brain feedback that is generated within the computers, and we harvest those unused electromagnetic fields in the computers as the carrier wave, and use that as the carrier wave.
When you say carrier wave, is that a frequency?
Is that a what?
Are you doing a amplitude modulated signal, like a?
It's a pulse wave modulated signal. So the carrier wave is pulse width modulating, is pulse width modulated by the EEG.
I'm getting a better understanding of just what's going on.
You know,
I'm
it's
getting
taken me
a slightly better idea of what's going on from a physical, electrical point of view, because seeing the charts of that, understanding what's attached, what it could be, then you say temperature now.
Yeah. And now temperature. So there used to be on the market skin temperature devices, which measure skin temperature. Getting feedback from a skin temperature device is a little like watching the grass grow. It's real slow. But that can be sped up by using some calculations on the rate of change of the temperature, which is instantaneous. The highest priority of the brain is to protect itself against seizures. So what it does is, in order to protect itself against seizures, like on the first graph,
hit escape before you do anything, because that's better now.
Len, just so you know, we got to wrap up pretty quick here.
okay. I don't know how to get this thing. Oh, I see. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Each of these graphs tracks what has happened to a specific site, whatever site it is. And it can change from graph to graph and from person to person, but it takes the same site and it measures the electrical activity at that site at the end of the treatment. And there are oftentimes, if it's a low amplitude site, generally the timing of the I don't know whether I should get into this. Yeah, I'll do it.
If it's too long, please don't. Sorry.
No, it isn't too long.
Okay.
The brain gets locked by this reduction in variability. And that locking is fed by the deepest parts of the brain. And once that's where this is interfered with, the process is interfered with, and it unlocks the brain. So the brain can relax and become more flexible in its responses.
One more question, but I mean, we need to keep it to like a minute.
Okay.
You know, when you talk about normalizing the variability, that would be kind of thing that the brain would do if it was dealing with new information and trying to do something creative or in a discussion and so on and so forth. And you said about people learn not to use their, full capacities. So it kind of looks like with the full duplex is what you've got when you say the signal
That's
both
correct.
is measured and it's going back. It's a full duplex connection. And you're just trying to normalize the spectrum that you're getting out of these different areas in relation to a idealized template. Have you looked at whether the same thing happens when people get in discussions that is new for them, or they're looking at information and trying to learn things that are
Yeah,
new?
this automatically follows the variations in the brain. And that's an algorithm in there that does that.
Yeah, there's so much that's been done about being able to filter EEGs and getting good spatial and time resolution and more electrodes and everything like that. But maybe this stuff also, have you looked at whether it raises serotonin levels or ATP level production?
No information on that. They're good questions.
Which probably it does, considering the way you describe what it's doing. It sounds like it must raise serotonin.
I would imagine so, or
and
dopamine.
The blood flow must wind up increasing ATP production and stuff like that. It should be easy to figure out with all the laboratory tests.
No, it takes money.
Yeah,
It takes huge amounts of money.
Well, cold calling to the right laboratories who do the right articles and getting a bunch of friends and a buzz going, and maybe it'll happen. I do stuff like that.
Cool.
Great. All right, guys, we need to wrap up here. So let's thank Len for his presentation.